Hello, fellow Trekkers. Steve here, talking about Star Trek Discovery and uh, nine Star Trek characters I'd like to see on Star Trek Discovery. Characters from other Star Trek shows popping up on the new Star Trek show, Star Trek Discovery. So, for those of you who haven't checked out Star Trek Discovery, it takes place 10 years before Kirk starts his 5-year mission. So they've had a few Star Trek characters from the original series pop up on Star Trek Discovery, like Sarek, Spock's father and his mother Amanda. We've both seen them. We've seen Harry Mudd and his wife Stella. We see her for the first time. She was in an episode of Star Trek. I think it was I Mudd, where they had an android replicants of her on this planet that Mudd had taken over, but this is actually the first time we've seen the actual Stella. So it kind of gets you thinking, what other Star Trek characters will they bring on Star Trek Discovery? And I've got 9 picks of characters I'd like to see. So we'll just start it with number one herself. This goes back to the Cage, the original Star Trek pilot, with Captain Pike, head of the captain of the USS Enterprise instead of Kirk, and his commanding officer was just simply referred to as number 1, played by Majel Barrett. Majel Barrett, Ron Barrett at the time. Interesting character, a female commanding officer. They didn't, keep her around after that first pilot. They decided they needed to change things. As William Shatner playing Captain Kirk, and then Spock takes over as the commanding officer. But number 1 has always been a lot of Trekkers a fan favorite. So I'd like to see her role expanded. Who was she? What was her actual name? Yeah. So number 1 is my number 1 pick for Star Trek characters. So we're talking early Star Trek. Let's talk about the Man Trap, the first episode of Star Trek to air on television. And we'll talk about the Salt Vampire. That would be my number 2 pick. That was a creature who could change forms and could just suck the life out of people. It's sort of like this octopus on two legs with a bunch of fur. Weird looking creature. McCoy ends up killing it by the end of the episode. I like to see the Salt Vampire brought back. And speaking of that episode, it also had the first person to die on Star Trek, and that would be Crewman Darnell. I like to see him pop up in Star Trek Discovery. Let's learn a little more about Darnell. I mean, what was going on in his life before he ended up on the Enterprise, and then on some planet where he gets the salt sucked out of him by this damn near extinct creature. He mentions, he'd been to the Wrigley's Pleasure Planet, so maybe that's where you could have a Star Trek Discovery episode set there. We're introduced to Darnell. Maybe he's works. Maybe he was on Star Trek Discovery before he transferred over to the Enterprise. What's up with Darnell? To just give a little bit of the background of that character. Okay, so that's 3 out of 9, 1/3 of the way there. So moving off of the original series, let's talk about Enterprise, which was a prequel to the original series 100 years before Kirk. Not a lot of characters you probably see from the Enterprise on this Star Trek Discovery, because this would be 90 years later. Most of those characters should be dead, except you have T'Pol, the one Vulcan. And Vulcans live long lives like Sarek. When he died, he was over 200 years old. So I think they should bring back T'Pol. I looked at Star Trek Alpha Discovery and discovered, when the character is born, did the math. So if she's still alive in Star Trek Discovery time, she'd be 168 years old. Then again, they don't really have to make her look like she's 168. There could just be some contrivancy where she was on a ship that got caught in some sort of time vortex. Discovery discovers it, and T'Pol is only in her 70s to 80s, which in human years would be like your late 30s to early 40s. So yeah, bring back T'Pol. And speaking of that, two characters kind of from Enterprise I'd like to see expanded on, and that would be Future Guy, who was the contact to the Suliban. We always saw in Shadows, and he was giving them technology from the future. They never explained who he was. I know expanded universe probably made up stories for him, but I'd like to see them bring back Future Guy and Chef, who was a character on Enterprise who mostly was just mentioned. He was only seen once, and they cropped off his face. But they're always talking about Chef and what he was going to cook. When they did the last episode, which was really just a Next Generation episode, like the Enterprise was on the, on the Enterprise D's holodeck. Riker was pretending to be a chef for the program. I'd like to see the actual chef character, and maybe him and Future Guy are one and the same. All right, so moving away from even the TV series, let's look at the movies. A few characters I'd like to see them bring back would be Sybok. I think I'm saying that name. Spock's brother from Star Trek V. I mean, if I remember the story correctly, Sybok was the one who wanted to find, God out in the universe. And Spock would not acknowledge him as his brother until, he was face to face. So, this would be Amanda's other adopted brother. So bring back Sybok. Get a little bit more into his background and character. So far they haven't mentioned him. From Star Trek VI, I'd like to see Gorkon brought back. Chancellor Gorkon, who negotiated the peace treaty between... Well, no, he didn't negotiate. Him and Spock were trying to, negotiate a peace treaty. He gets assassinated in zero gravity, gets shot, all the purple blood comes flying out, and his last dying words are, "Don't let it end here." He seemed like a cool character. I mean, he's walking around with a giant bone as his cane. Maybe we get a background to him in Star Trek Discovery. They're fighting Klingons, so what was he doing around that time? And maybe it kind of explains why he thought there needed to be peace between, the Federation and the Klingon Empire. And my last one, I would say maybe some relative of Worf's, but I don't know who that character would be. I don't think you could call him, the character could be Moog if it's supposed to be his great-grandfather, or Worf if it's his great-grandfather. But I'd like to see some ancestor of Worf's, back when the House of Moog existed and was fighting for the Klingon Empire. And that would be a good excuse to bring back Michael Dorn, have him play a role in Star Trek Discovery. So that would be 9. And I'm going to leave it there. Who would you like to see brought back on Star Trek Discovery from one of the other shows or one of the movies? What characters would you like to see? And just leave your answers in the comments below.